Folks, on May 8th of 2018, just after noon on a Tuesday, a veteran police detective in Westfield, Massachusetts, picked up the phone and called 911. He told the dispatcher that his wife had just shot herself. His name was Brian Fanion. Her name was Amy. She was 51 years old, and she was lying on the floor of their dining room, in the old farmhouse she loved, with an untouched peanut butter and jelly sandwich still sitting on a plate on the table. Now, from that very first phone call, there were only ever two stories about what happened in that house. Brian's story was that Amy grabbed his service weapon in a fit of anger and turned it on herself before he could reach her. The state's story, the one prosecutors would eventually take to a jury, was that Brian Fanion, a respected detective, a church deacon, a man whose family name meant something in that town, shot his wife of 33 years and dressed it up to look like a suicide. One of those stories is a tragedy. The other one is a murder. And nearly 5 years later, 12 ordinary people in a Springfield courtroom had to decide which one was true. So today, let's walk through this case together. The marriage, the lunch hour, the evidence, and the trial. And I'll let you make up your own mind along the way. Before we get into it, if you enjoy taking these cases slow and careful, the way they deserve, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this little channel, and it lets me keep doing this. All right, let's go back to Westfield. Westfield, Massachusetts, is one of those New England towns where the same family names come up generation after generation. And the Fanion name was one of them. Brian Fanion came from a long line of police officers and public servants, and one local reporter, Stephanie Barry of the Republican newspaper, reportedly described the Fanions as being something like the Kennedys of Westfield. That's the kind of standing we're talking about. Brian himself worked in the detective bureau of the Westfield Police Department, where he handled evidence. Think about that for a moment, because it's going to matter later. His job, folks, was evidence. Amy's maiden name was Hanson. She was one of several sisters, and by all accounts, the Hanson girls were known around town as some of the kindest, prettiest, smartest young women in school. Amy met Brian back in 1983, when she was just 16 and he was 19. They married in 1985, raised 2 children, Travis and Victoria, and built a life centered on their church. Brian served as a deacon. He even traveled to Mexico on mission trips to help build wells. Amy, her friends said, believed being a mother was the best job in the whole world. She was a woman of deep faith who kept a journal, and in it she wrote about light and shadow, about how shadows appear when something blocks the light, and about being called to turn toward the light and the truth. I think about that journal entry a lot with this case. You'll see why. By the spring of 2018, the Fanions had been married more than 3 decades, and Brian was approaching retirement. And according to Brian himself, that's exactly what they were arguing about. He would later tell state police detectives that he and Amy had gotten into a heated disagreement the night before her death about what retirement should look like. He reportedly didn't want to spend his golden years maintaining their 200-year-old farmhouse on North Road. Amy loved that house. He didn't want another dog tying them down. Amy always wanted a dog. He wanted to travel more than she did, and on the day she died, according to Brian, Amy had signed them both up to attend a family member's play on the same day he wanted to be at a disc golf tournament, without asking him first. Now here's the timeline as Brian told it. He left the Westfield police station around 11:45 that morning and drove home to meet Amy for lunch. She was making those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. The argument from the night before picked right back up. At some point, Brian said, he needed to use the bathroom, so he took his duty weapon, a Sould .45 caliber Smith & Wesson, out of its holster and set it down on the hutch in the dining room. When he came out, he said, Amy was holding the gun to the right side of her head, saying something like, "You obviously don't want me around." He told detectives he was only 4 or 5 feet away, that he lunged to stop her, that he almost made it. "The gun just exploded," he said. "That fast, no hesitation." Minutes later, he was on the phone with 911, and Amy's own brother, Eric Hansen, who had reportedly been playing disc golf on the property behind the house, came running in to find his sister on the floor and Brian holding her hand. Eric was so worried about Brian's state of mind, according to investigators, that he picked the gun up himself and moved it out of Brian's reach. When Massachusetts State Police detectives arrived at the farmhouse around 1 o'clock, here's what they walked into. Amy Fanion in the dining room, gone from a single gunshot wound to the head, blood spatter around the window frame leading to the breezeway, a pair of eyeglasses with what looked like reddish-brown spatter on them, the spent shell casing in the dining room, the bullet itself resting out in the enclosed porch, chairs pushed about, and on the table, that intact sandwich on one plate, and a second, empty plate with a smear of blood on it. Detective Brendan O'Toole of the State Police knew Brian Fanion. Most law enforcement in that area did. He offered Brian his condolences and promised him a thorough investigation, by the numbers. But standing in that dining room, taking in that scene, O'Toole later said something stopped him. He looked at the entry wound on the right side of Amy's head, and in that moment, it didn't seem right to him. He couldn't have said exactly why yet, but he was about to find out. And the finding out started that very afternoon. Detective O'Toole made a decision right there at the scene. Because the gun involved was Brian Fanion's own duty weapon, and because Brian was a fellow law enforcement officer that everybody in the area knew and respected, O'Toole decided the Massachusetts State Police would handle this investigation alone. No Westfield involvement, no conflicts of interest. And he asked Brian to come with him to the State Police barracks in Russell to give a recorded statement. Brian agreed. At 2:41 in the afternoon, less than 3 hours after Amy died, the tape recorder clicked on. Now, most of what I told you in part 1, the retirement argument, the play versus the disc golf tournament, the gun on the hutch, the bathroom, all of that comes from this first interview. And on its face, folks, it held together. A grieving husband, in shock, walking a fellow officer through the worst hour of his life. Brian described Amy as a woman with a temper, but a temper she reportedly hid from everyone but him. She only got that angry, he said, when the two of them were alone. When O'Toole asked about mental health, Brian mentioned that many years earlier Amy had gone through some psychological difficulties and had been on medication for a period of time. But nothing recent, nothing that would explain a Tuesday lunch turning into this. Then, partway through that interview, O'Toole asked a question that detectives ask in every case like this one, almost as a formality. Were there any female friends in Brian's life? And Brian said yes. There was a woman in Pittsfield he'd met recently, a fellow missionary from a nearby church. They'd met in November of 2017 on a mission trip to Mexico and become good friends. Her name was Corrine Knowles. She went by Corey. And then Brian asked the detectives a question of his own. He wanted to know whether they were going to contact her. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think it tells you something. His wife had been dead for a matter of hours, and he was asking investigators whether they planned to talk to his friend. At the end of the interview, O'Toole asked Brian to hand over his personal cell phone, and Brian did. But according to O'Toole, once the recorder was switched off, Brian told him something to the effect of, "You're going to see some things on there, and it's not what it appears to be." O'Toole would later call that one of several red flags. But he also said something I respect, which is that an investigator has to keep an open mind. So that's what they did. They kept an open mind, and they sent that phone to the lab. What came back, folks, was a treasure trove. Hundreds of deleted text messages between Brian Fanion and Corey Knowles. Messages that painted a very different picture from the word friendship. On May 7th, the day before Amy died, the two of them reportedly exchanged 72 text messages, going until 9:47 that night. In one exchange around 9:23 p.m., Brian wished her good night and called her his love, writing about wonderful dreams of amazing days and nights to come. She answered him the same way, saying she would dream of him and of everything the future held for the two of them. And the next morning, the morning of the day Amy Fanion died, Corey texted to ask when she could hold him again. Brian's answer, reportedly, was that it couldn't come soon enough. Within roughly 2 hours of that message, Amy was dead on the dining room floor. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because an affair is not a murder. People stray from their marriages every day in this country, and the overwhelming majority of them never harm anyone. The detectives knew that too. One of them said almost exactly that to Brian's face. But what the phone told investigators was simpler than guilt or innocence. It told them Brian Fanion had not been entirely truthful, and when a witness hasn't been truthful, you talk to him again. So on May 17, 2018, 3 days after Amy's wake, where Brian had planted a tree in her memory at Stanley Park, Brian Fanion came back in for a second interview. This time, detectives read him his Miranda rights. Brian noticed. He asked them, essentially, what had changed. And that same day, across town, detectives sat down with Corey Knowles herself. Corey was 48, a wife, a grandmother, a member of her church choir. She told detectives that Brian's friendship had helped her through a troubled second marriage, that he was easy to talk to, all affirmation and warmth. But she was honest about where it had gone. She admitted she felt real passion for him. She described the relationship crossing the line from friendship into something physical, a first kiss in the Fanion kitchen in mid-April of 2018, before Amy got home from work, and later, passionate meetings in her truck near Stanley Park, with Brian leaving work early to see her. By her account, it never became a full physical affair, and she reportedly said Brian held back in part because he was still married to Amy. Confronted with the messages, Brian didn't deny it. He admitted the relationship had escalated, said he was embarrassed and ashamed, said it never should have happened. And then detectives asked him to walk through Amy's death one more time, step by step. Where was she standing when he came out of the bathroom? Was she sitting or standing? Where exactly was the gun? And this time, according to the detectives, Brian seemed to waver on the details. Sitting, standing, he wasn't sure. What Brian Fanion did not know, as he sat in that room going back over his story, was that 2 documents had just landed on the investigators' desks: the crime scene report and Amy's autopsy results. And according to those findings, the wound that killed Amy Fanion was not consistent with a wound she could have given herself. Now, to understand why those findings mattered so much, we need to talk for a moment about distance. When a gun is fired at very close range, pressed against a person or held just inches away, it doesn't only send out a bullet. It expels a cloud of debris, what investigators call gunshot residue, and that residue leaves a distinct pattern on and around the wound. It's a pattern examiners know well, and it's one of the ways they distinguish a self-inflicted wound from one that came from farther away. According to the state's crime scene analysis and the autopsy findings, that pattern was not there on Amy Fanion, and in the state's view, that meant one thing: the gun that killed Amy had not been right against her head, the way Brian said it was. The medical examiner listed Amy's manner of death as undetermined, not suicide, not yet homicide, but for the detectives sitting across from Brian Fanion in that second interview, the case had just turned a corner. And here's where this case becomes something I have honestly never seen play out quite this way. Because when the detectives laid it out for Brian, told him plainly that the findings showed no indication the gun was close to Amy's head, they were not talking to an ordinary suspect. They were talking to a 20-plus-year evidence officer who understood exactly what they were saying and exactly what it implied. Detectives Brendan O'Toole and Mike Blanchette have reportedly done thousands of interviews between them, and they later admitted this was one of the hardest of their careers, precisely because Brian knew how the job works. Brian did not bend. He insisted the gun was right there. His words, over and over, were that it was right there, that he saw it with his own eyes, and that if the reports said otherwise, then the reports were flat out wrong. And then one of the detectives put the alternative to him about as bluntly as it can be put. The other possibility, he said, was that Brian got angry, stood a foot or a few feet away, and shot his wife in the head while she sat eating her sandwich. Brian's answer was 3 words, repeated: didn't happen. Did not happen. So now investigators had an affair the man had hidden, deleted messages to his girlfriend hours before his wife's death, and forensic findings that in their reading contradicted his account. What they did next was by the book. On May 24, 2018, they obtained a search warrant for the Fanion home. Detectives took new measurements to map the trajectory of the bullet. Remember, it had passed through Amy, struck a dresser, and come to rest in the breezeway. They confiscated Brian's home electronics, and at the same time, over at the Westfield police station, they seized his desktop computer and his laptop for data extraction. When they arrived at the house that day, Brian reportedly asked the detective 2 questions. Was he there to arrest him, and did the detective think he did it? The detective didn't answer the second one. What came off those computers, folks, we'll get to at trial. because it became some of the most argued over evidence in this whole case. For now, I'll just say the Cyber Crimes Unit found search activity that prosecutors would call deeply incriminating, and the defense would call completely innocent, and both sides had a story for it. The case landed on the desk of Hampden County Assistant District Attorney Mary Sandstrom. She was new to the homicide unit, and she wasn't a local. She'd come to Massachusetts by way of New York, and she was candid about what that meant. Westfield is a small, tightly connected community where everybody knows everybody by name, and she didn't. And the man she was building a case against wasn't just any defendant. He was a Fanion in Westfield, and a respected detective besides. And then came the complication I find most heartbreaking in this entire story. As the investigation ground on through 2018 and into 2019, Corey ended the relationship that summer, and Brian retired from the police force in early 2019. A letter arrived in the case file. It came from Amy's own family. Her siblings signed it. Her own mother signed it. And in it they expressed their unfailing support for Brian Fanion and stated they were certain Amy had taken her own life. Think about the position that puts a prosecutor in. Sandstrom said herself it was an odd and awkward spot, pursuing a murder case where the victim's family is standing behind the accused. In my opinion, that letter tells you just how deeply this community, and this family, believed in the man they knew. These weren't strangers being fooled by a smooth talker. These were the people who loved Amy most in the world, and they could not imagine Brian doing this. Whether that's a testament to his innocence or to how well he was trusted, well, that's exactly what the jury would eventually have to weigh. The state kept working. They wanted more testing done, as strong a case as they could carry into a grand jury. And on November 6, 2019, 17 months after Amy died, detectives drove out to Brian Fanion's door. He answered quickly and let them in. He was standing there eating from a container of assorted nuts, popping them into his mouth, when Detective Blanchette told him they had a warrant for his arrest. He put his hands behind his back, the nuts dropped to the floor, and the handcuffs went on. He was taken to the Russell Barracks, processed, photographed, fingerprinted. One of the detectives later described the look on his face as pure disbelief, a man who could not accept that this was happening to him. Days later, inside Hampden County Superior Court in Springfield, Brian Fanion stood for arraignment and pleaded not guilty to murder. The courtroom was packed, and reporter Stephanie Berry described the shock in that room as something you could feel. And sitting in the gallery, right behind the accused, were members of both families, Brian's and Amy's. A man was now charged with murdering his wife, and his wife's own mother was sitting on his side of the courtroom. On February 23, 2023, nearly 5 years after Amy Fanion died in her dining room, Brian Fanion's trial opened in Springfield in what became the most publicized case Westfield had seen in a long, long time. He was charged with first-degree murder, and in Massachusetts, that charge carries a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Everything was on the table. In her opening, the prosecution painted Brian as a man trapped, a deacon at his church, an officer of the law, a Fanion in Westfield, a man whose whole identity rested on his standing, who wanted out of his marriage but, in the state's telling, could not bear the public shame of a divorce. ADA Mary Sandstrom would put the theory plainly. He had chosen his next life partner in Corey, and Amy was the only thing standing in the way. He couldn't divorce her without it costing him his reputation, and, according to testimony we'll get to, possibly a large share of his retirement. Divorce is public, but in his mind, prosecutors argued, murder didn't have to be. The defense, led by attorney Jeffrey Brown, told the jury a very different story, the same story Brian had told from the first hour, that Amy struggled with anxiety and had a temper, that Brian had to tread lightly around her for fear of setting her off, and that on May 8th, an argument about retirement and a family member's play pushed her past her breaking point. Not a murder, the defense said, a tragedy that happened in seconds, right in front of a helpless husband. Then the witnesses started coming, and folks, over 12 days, the state called 27 of them. Let me walk you through the pillars of that case, because it really rested on 3. The first pillar was family. Anna Hansen, Amy's younger sister, took the stand, and I want you to appreciate what that took. because Anna had signed that family letter of support, and she was the only member of the family who willingly testified against Brian. She told the jury that during the investigation, her brother-in-law confided he was worried about searches on his computer. She asked him what searches, and according to Anna's sworn testimony, Brian told her he had searched the phrase, "how to make a murder look like a suicide." She was firm that those were his exact words. When she asked him why on earth he'd searched such a thing, Brian reportedly told her Amy had asked him to look it up after they watched a crime show together. Anna told the jury she couldn't recall her sister ever saying she even liked those shows. The second pillar was Corey herself, by then divorced and remarried, testifying under the name Corey Hasty. She told the jury that Brian had talked about what a divorce would cost him. According to her testimony, he said that if Amy ever left him or he divorced her, she would take him for everything he had, and he wouldn't be able to stay on his retirement. Now the affair had a financial shadow attached to it, and the third pillar, in my opinion the one the whole case leaned on, was the digital and forensic evidence. Tom Forrest of the Cyber Crimes Unit walked the jury through Brian's office computer at the Westfield police station. Starting around the time the relationship with Corey began, that computer reportedly visited pages about common and dangerous poisons, about which drugs cause the most deaths each year, about household items that can kill, about carbon monoxide, about prescription overdoses. And then this, 11 days before Amy's death, that same office computer was used to watch a news video on YouTube about what gunshot residue tests can tell investigators. The prosecution hammered the context. Brian reportedly had no active cases in April or May of 2018 that would have required it, and nobody at Westfield PD even performs gunshot residue testing. Even the reporters covering the trial sensed the weight of that one. Whatever else was arguable, a detective with no relevant caseload had studied the very science that would later sit at the center of his wife's death investigation. Then came the state's ballistics expert, Detective John Crane, and he brought the numbers. Based on the absence of gunshot residue around the wound and the trajectory of the bullet, he testified that Amy was shot from a downward angle and from a distance of at least 18 inches, with nothing in between. 18 inches, folks. Remember Brian's account, the gun pressed to the side of her head, his hands almost reaching her. The state's expert was telling the jury that physically, forensically, that could not be what happened. You cannot hold a gun to your own head from 1.5 feet away. So picture the case the jury now had in front of them. Deleted love texts the night before the death and the morning of it. A husband who admitted, on tape, that he wasn't truthful at first. A sister swearing he'd described searching how to stage a suicide. A computer trail of poisons and residue science with no professional explanation. A financial motive tied to his pension, and an expert saying the fatal shot came from too far away to be self-inflicted. After those 12 days and 27 witnesses, the prosecution rested. If the trial had ended right there, I don't think many people in that courtroom would have hesitated. But trials don't end when the state sits down. Jeffrey Brown had been waiting, and the defense was about to introduce something that took direct aim at the foundation of the entire case, that 18-inch conclusion. Because according to the man the defense brought in, a certified crime scene analyst with published research to his name, the state's cornerstone finding rested on a mistake, something the examiners never tested, something as ordinary and as overlooked as Amy Fanion's own hair. His name was Alexander Jason, and he came to court as a senior certified crime scene analyst, and the argument he made for the defense was, in plain terms, this. The state built its whole case on the absence of gunshot residue around the wound, and that absence proved nothing, because of Amy's hair. Here's the theory. Amy Fanion had very thick, dense hair where the bullet entered. Jason's position, backed by research he published in an FBI forensic science journal back in 2004, was that hair like that can act as a filter, catching and trapping the residue before it ever reaches the skin. If that's what happened, then the gun could have been fired at close range, exactly as Brian described, and the wound would still look clean. And Jason pointed the finger at the examiners for what he called a mistake. Nobody ever tested Amy's hair for trapped residue. The one thing that could have settled the question, in his view, was never analyzed. His bottom line, as he put it, was that a man should not be convicted on that basis. Now, his testimony was reportedly limited at trial, and I want to be honest with you. I'm not a forensic scientist, and I can't tell you whether hair truly filters residue the way he says. But it was a real published theory, aimed straight at the foundation of the state's case, and the jury had to weigh it. The defense chipped at the other pillars too. On cross-examination, Corey Hasty admitted that when she ended the relationship in the summer of 2018, Brian's response was essentially just, okay. He didn't fight for her. He never said anything like, I did this terrible thing for you and now you're leaving. If Corey was the motive, the defense asked, where was the desperation? They offered innocent explanations for some of the computer searches too. An aging house, an old wood-burning stove, and a young niece who was reportedly going to be staying with the Fanions, which they said explained the interest in carbon monoxide and household poisons. And they got the cyber expert to confirm, under oath, that no search for the phrase, how to make a murder look like a suicide, was ever actually found on any device. Anna's testimony about that phrase was her word about a conversation, not a recovered search. And then the defense did something painful. They put Amy's own family on the stand to talk about her temper. Her mother, Patricia, confirmed her daughter could snap at Brian in front of others, in a way that embarrassed her. Her sister Holly described the same. And Amy's own son, Travis, testified that he could picture his mother grabbing that gun impulsively in a moment of rage, picking it up intending to pull the trigger. Folks, whatever you believe about this case, take a moment for that family. A mother, sisters, and children who lost Amy and then had to sit in a courtroom and take sides against each other about how they lost her. After 15 days of testimony and some 40 witnesses in all, both sides closed. The defense told the jury Amy raised that gun in a fit of rage and caused her own death. The prosecution told them Brian Fanion murdered his wife with deliberate premeditation. On March 21, 2023, the case went to the jury, 12 people deciding between two stories that could not both be true. The deliberations took 2 days, and when the foreperson stood, the answer was guilty. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Brian Fanion was sentenced that same day to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reporter Stephanie Barry described Brian's side of the courtroom simply collapsing in sobs. And remember, that side included members of Amy's family, people who loved her and sincerely believed to the end that Brian was innocent. For ADA Mary Sandstrom, there was no victory lap. She said Amy should be here, with her daughter, her son, her grandchildren, and that it was all so one man could enjoy his life while ending hers. I keep coming back to Amy's journal, the one her friend shared. Amy wrote that shadows are created when something, or someone, blocks the light. She wrote about turning toward the light and the truth. In my opinion, and it is only my opinion, the truth in this case took 5 years to come out of the shadows, and it took a sister willing to stand alone against her whole family, and investigators willing to look hard at one of their own. But I could be wrong. There are good people in Westfield, people who knew Brian Fanion far better than you or I ever will, who believe to this day that an innocent man is sitting in prison and that the hair theory was never given its due. So here's what I want to ask you, and I genuinely read every comment. That letter, signed by Amy's siblings and her own mother, declaring they were certain Amy took her own life. Do you think a family's certainty like that should carry weight in a case? Or do you think love can blind even the people closest to the truth? And the 18 inches versus the hair, which expert did you find more convincing? Tell me below, because I know this community has sharp eyes, and honestly, you all catch things I miss. Before I let you go, this case touches on suicide, even though a jury ultimately found it was murder. If you or someone you love is struggling, please reach out to someone. Help is out there, and you matter. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. If you'd like more cases told slowly and carefully, without the shouting, hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the next one. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other, folks. I'll see you in the next one.